The Putin regime has exploited the vulnerabilities of global social media platforms using bots and trolls to promote its narratives. They also use it for coercive manipulation to change public attitudes towards Ukraine aid and to cause fear, indecision, hesitation, and caution amongst politicians and geopolitical commentators. But Russia is not alone in using these methods. Once developed, the same techniques can be used by other powers, international and local, to subvert democratic institutions and to warp public perception of the news and politics in their countries. And in this year of numerous elections, Russian multi-front aggression, including information warfare and cyber, poses an enormous threat. Welcome to this debate on Silicon Curtain. Please definitely like, subscribe, share this if you think this content is important, and definitely please join the debate and add comments to the videos. It will also help people through YouTube's algorithm to find the fantastic speakers that you'll be hearing today. And I'd like to introduce them. Gundars Bergmanis Koratz is the principal scientist at NATO Stratcom COE. He holds a PhD in signal and image processing from the University of Lorraine in France. In his role, Gundars concentrates on projects that explore the diverse applications of artificial intelligence in strategic communications, analyzing the risks and opportunities presented by this technology. And I'd also like to introduce the founder and CEO at Osavo, Dmytro Pleshakov. His work focuses on countering disinformation and influence operations using AI technologies. Now, before we dive into the debate, I'd like each of you to introduce yourselves and say a little bit more about the work that you do to counter disinformation. Dmytro, maybe you could go first.
Yeah, hi Jonathan, and thanks for having me here. So I'm co-founder and CEO at Osavo. We are an AI-powered company building a technology to better identify, assess, and counter threats online. Threats like dis and misinformation, influence operations, and more broadly speaking, information threats. So things that are intentionally targeting people or organizations and trying to harm their reputation or change the opinions or change the sentiments using various tools. And we've been building this since Russian invasion to Ukraine in early 2022. The company originally was brought to life mainly because of what happened in Ukraine, and me and my co-founder in the first place started this to be involved on the defense side of the things in Ukraine, but pretty soon we realized that the problem is much broader and much more global. So as of now, we are operating globally, helping our clients and partners in very different locations from the US to Europe, to some Asian countries as well, to identify those types of things, because those things are omnipresent, growing, and there are many tech enablers that are making things even worse, which I think we're going to cover later in the conversation.
We definitely are. We're going to take a deep dive into that, not just how Ukraine is remaining resilient in the face of Russian informational aggression, but how Europe needs to develop its own resilient capabilities. Gundars, that's a good place to bring you in. Could you describe a bit more about your work and how you're using AI to tackle this growing threat from disinformation narratives?
Yes, thank you, Jonathan, for introducing me. As I already mentioned, I'm a principal scientist, and I work in a technical scientific development branch. And our small team, we are focusing a lot on how technology changes the perception of how people are consuming information, how hostile actors are influencing Western audiences, and what is the overall relevance of these technologies and its development for NATO. So we are conducting various research and experiments as well. So we are trying to understand, and we are assessing over time how social media companies, platforms are able to deal with commercial manipulations. how Russia and other actors are creating hostile narratives, what kind of tactics they use, how generative AI comes into the play, and of course we are teaming up and working closely with leading industry representatives as possible as well to get even deeper insights on cross platforms, how these hostile activities and hostile communications takes place in nowadays on those platforms.
Well, Russian propaganda has been described as a process of hijacking reality, trying to create an alternative version of reality, which is imbued with not only its own narratives, but also tries to align people's actions with its strategic purpose, whether that is to sow division or to have specific policies and behaviors. But of course, the advent of AI is being grafted on to these traditional activities of disinformation. What is going to be the effect? Is it going to be effect of intensity, scale, effectiveness, bringing costs down? What are the various impacts of the introduction of generative AI into propaganda? Dimitro.
That's a very good question where there's a lot of debates and discussions happening, generally a very hot topic, right? Everyone these days is talking Gen AI and what's going to be the impact. And there are many concerns because surprisingly, some people say we don't see that much of Gen AI, right? As we would have imagined. Like the models are there, OpenAI, Midjourney, and all that stuff. Why don't we still live in the reality which is fully altered by all of that? On the other hand, we see that the impact is clearly there. And the research that we recently published together with Gunders, it shows that AI is not a hypothetical threat that just can be used, it's actually used. And here I think that it's important to understand the term of AI generally a little bit more broadly than by just talking about Gen AI. Mainly when we say generative AI, what we have in mind is deepfakes, right? So altered images and videos that look like real, but are not real, right? Have nothing to do with the reality. In fact, that's not the only thing you can do with the AI. And AI is applied on every single stage of this process of creating and disseminating propaganda. So if you put yourself into the shoes of the threat actor, imagine you're a Russian agency involved in building an influence operation. So there are many stages, right? It all starts with creating infrastructure to further boost your messaging and your narratives. And this infrastructure involves accounts, it involves bot accounts, personas who's going to be later utilized. This is a very good step to apply AI, even for smaller things. Like you create your bots, you need avatars for all of them. You need profile pictures. Where would you get them? You can apply Gen AI and have that, and we see that at scale. So now massively bots that are being uncovered, they use these Gen AI created images. There is a very recent story from the US, from Department of Justice. I think just yesterday, they took down a network of 900 accounts on Twitter that were linked to Russia. And I cross-checked those accounts, and a lot of them had the Gen AI generated profile pictures. So quite a small thing, right? It doesn't change the whole world, but it's very practical. And then when you need to bring traffic to your media, to personas that you created. So you need to generate some content, not necessarily political content, not necessarily content that's going to alter the reality, but just something that's going to attract audiences. Again, we see here that this content already can be generated and is generated by the AI. It can be something that looks very, very very nice. It can be not a hostile thing. It can be anything from sports comments to random conversations on history. But then by creating this background content, you attract audiences, you generate search results, whatever, and you build up the audience, which further then can be used by something else. And so on and so forth. There are many use cases, like some of them are pretty trivial, like machine translation, for example. It's AI under the hood that can take your Russian text and bring it to any language of the world with very good quality. It was not the case 2 years ago. It is the case now, and largely empowered by the large language models, and so on and so forth. So if you start looking more like sort of creatively from different angles, you realize that AI can be applied throughout the process in so many places. And basically, it makes the process more streamlined and scalable. And that's the main risk that we think is going to be more and more materialized as it goes, is that very easy to scale things. You don't need to hire huge teams of hundreds of people to do it, especially those teams previously, you need to have people speaking different languages, have specific expertise. Now you can run an influence operation having a couple of people in place, or maybe with just one person. So much cheaper, much easier to scale. That would be my take.
And this is an interesting question for Gundars here, because with this ability to produce content in multiple languages using Gen AI and to develop multiple personas and tones that make it much more readable and much more authentic, Russia is able to produce propaganda for a great number of regions. And I think one of the challenges we've seen, isn't it, is that the global south, or countries of the global south, Middle East, and many other territories, including countries in Africa and so on, are awash with Russian propaganda. Has AI been able to bring down the sort of unit cost to actually scale their propaganda around the world for multiple languages, multiple regions, multiple cultures?
So there are definitely interests from in Russia, from the Russian side, to use this technology. I would say that translation and translating the disinformation content is not a new thing, because the translators have been available already for a long time, and the same goes for image alteration, different software like Photoshop and so on. So this kind of technology has been already available for now. But what it gives right now, what comes into the play is that, as similarly as Twitch already mentioned, and you already, Jonathan, also mentioned and touched upon it, about this sentiment, style, different these linguistic features that can be altered and used. So one of the challenges for these disinformation actors is, if you have a small team and you have one model, one really mighty model, how to diversify the content so it wouldn't look like it comes from the same place. So controlling these models, that's one of the arts that these disinformation actors are trying to master, I suppose, already nowadays. And we see on a lot of platforms that naive implementations of these automated content disseminators might fail, but often because of the spent tokens, if they use these commercial services, AI services, or if you implement naively these content generators, and these content generators encounter the prompt injects that ask to reveal the instructions, then you can easily uncover such accounts by just replying to them on social media platforms. When we talk about the other languages, there are still challenges because these models are not equally performant on all languages equally. If you look at the Baltic languages, for example, or we look at the languages overseas or in Africa, let's say, then these models, the same models like ChatGPT and other models might not be, but might not provide the same quality of the content. And when we saw one of the largest bot networks here in Latvia that responded to one of the sports event-related issue, the content that they tried to push was actually really low quality. But it doesn't mean that it's everywhere like this. If you look at Ukraine, we might probably see an increase in quality of the comments that are hostile towards Ukraine. And also, we shouldn't forget that they are focusing a lot on their own internal audiences in Russia. And there they have like more degrees of freedom in creating the high quality content. So targeting the small languages and less common languages that are less supported by these technologies is still challenging and difficult, and they are risking and revealing their like underlying infrastructure. So I would say that the interest is really high. So experimentation is ongoing. They are trying to do their best to implement these technologies to optimize their workflows. But whether they are really successful, I would, at this very point, I would a bit doubt it. But this is just the current state. The technology really develops really fast, and we might see huge improvements and also improved and more automatized information operations elsewhere.
And Dmitry, I find it absolutely fascinating that you mentioned Midjourney, you mentioned ChatGPT-4 and so on. Is Russian disinformation operations really dependent on using foreign software, foreign technology, foreign components as well in the hardware? To an extent, this is an infrastructure which they are entirely dependent on, being able to circumvent sanctions and so on, and be able to use this software with or without, official licenses. Or is there a trend that Russia's starting to develop its own domestic versions? I did see some articles saying that they're trying, but the quality seems to be extremely poor.
There is a good piece of evidence that some known models are being used. And how do we even know what model was used? One way to identify it is by failures. So if they misuse the model, if they fall into model's guardrails, then we will be able to see it. There is a very known meme about ChatGPT's security text. So when you ask GPT to do something that is not allowed, right, to be asked, GPT will give you a standard answer. Like, as an AI language model, I cannot do this or that. And at some point of time, Twitter was flooded with tweets containing this phrase, letting you understand that someone used it before, and it was GPT. But the models and the evolution of models is so rapid today that you might not even need commercial models. The world of open source is very diverse and very colorful and very rapid. So you have new models being released almost like every week. Most of them have licenses that allow you to use them, like for various purposes. And if you're a hostile actor, you don't care much about licenses, right? If you're a Russian actor, if it's out there in the open source, you just take it. There is a large repository of open source models called Hugging Face. So it's a place where you can very simply, like in a torrent, if your audience is familiar with what torrents used to be, or any basically repository of files. You go there, and within a couple of clicks, you download an open source model to your local computer, and now you're empowered to do whatever you want. You have the almost full freedom. Moreover, you can alter this model. You can fine tune it. You can trade it further for your own use cases on your own data. So there is no doubt that things like this are happening in Russia. It would be hard to give a precise evidence because we cannot interfere into their computers. Maybe at some point hackers will give us the solid evidence, but it would be very weird if they wouldn't do that, because it's very easy to do. It's on the table, and it brings value, and it saves you cost. One of the aspects of GPT, let's say, it's pretty costly to run it at scale. With open source models, it can be much cheaper. So very good chance they are using it. And just wanted to add one point to the previous question, which I think is also important when it comes to quality, right? The models, both open source and commercial, will not give you a super brilliant quality in every single case. Of course, if you use it at scale for various threads, conversations, and topics, at some time you'll see glitches and you'll see problems. And a professional audience will be able to understand, okay, that's something wrong with this content. But the thing is that in their content strategy, in most cases, they have two types of content, like the background noise, so-called, and the bullet that they use to actually deliver the message that they need, right? And the ratio is that you need maybe 100 pieces of noise for one bullet that you deliver. And with this background content that just generates audience, that just generates authenticity, and kind of lets you pretend that you're a normal account, you don't care about quality that much. You just generate something. And this something, for this purpose specifically, large language models are great. So And then if you need every once in a while to interfere and see the particular narrative, you can do it manually because it's a very small effort compared to this whole administration of the whole content that you need to create.
And Gundars, is that one of the challenges here that constantly, what you're doing, what Dimitra's doing is having to react to Russian aggressive disinformation. You can't actually go to the root. You can't block them from using licenses. You can't block certain technologies to Russia. Essentially, they have access to an extent to everything we have, and you can only create responses, defenses to that.
In a way, yes, but there are mechanisms that can be used to prevent that. For example, regulating the gatekeepers, the social media platforms, and continuously testing them and keeping them accountable for hosting, basically keeping the illegal content or hostile content on their platforms. What I want to bring attention to is also these AI services and the security guardrails that they are implementing in to prevent these commercial models to generate a hostile and potentially disinformation content. Hopefully, these security guardrails will also improve over time. So recently, OpenAI released a threat report where they claim that the fully automated AI-generated disinformation didn't manage to gain attraction to the general audiences because it's not that organic, this kind of communication. So it's really difficult to convince people that this fully automated content is the relevant one they should rely on. However, we shouldn't forget about the specific fringe groups, the conspiracy theorists and so on. They are prone to believing many things, and even low quality content, especially the low quality content that can also be generated by artificial intelligence. And most importantly, what I want to stress is that just as Dmitro said, creating noise, and they are doing it at scale with low quality, and they are pushing out on different platforms on web, like low quality articles with a negative stance stolen from BBC or some other big names, these are being indexed by the search engines as well. And when someone tries to understand what is happening without a good media literacy skills, and it just puts the keywords on the search engine, and just you receive you are getting trapped into this void of indexed AI-generated misinformation or disinformation, and then you can convince yourself that maybe this is true, or you should not believe the governmental authorities and so on. So the transparency is being blurred, and you're being just confused, and that's one of the aims of these disinformation actors, actually, to create noise, to confuse people. So there are challenges, and then we arrive at the topic of resilience building that we will discuss probably later. But yeah, so creating cooperations, and actually following up what is happening on different platforms, and making them accountable. I think that's one of the remedies how we could envision a bit brighter future.
Well, we'll definitely cover resilience soon, but let's keep on the threat. So properly explore what we're actually faced with, because there is the everyday use of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. There's various categorizations of that. But then you also have periods of where there's big stories, big events. Whether those events are planned and the propaganda is prepared up front, or whether an event happens and then propaganda needs to be reactive to it. Are you able to see differences in patterns of behavior and the origins and sources of a story, and how the stories propagate, depending on whether propaganda is being reactive or whether it's pre-planned? For instance, there was, maybe a certain pattern of behavior around Skripal in the UK when the sort of Novichok was used to poison a former KGB officer. And then you have MH17, And you have an event like Kakhovka last year, and of course the attack on the cancer hospital in Kiev on Monday. Some of these events, like MH17, probably not pre-planned, but the attack on Monday almost certainly was. So is it possible to see a difference in the pattern and propagation of propaganda based on these different events? Let's start with Dimitro.
The pattern is kind of common to many campaigns that they run, and this tragic event that happened earlier this week with the attack on the children's hospital is not an is again unfortunately a very typical thing and that the way it was covered in the information environment, and we monitored that, and we even prepared a report ad hoc very quickly to see what's happening. I would say that the strategy, especially in these types of events, that there's a whole class of events. We call them information alibis. Like when you commit a war crime, but you want to mask it and you want to present yourself in a better light. So the strategy usually is to seed doubts and seed hesitations among people who are generally hesitant in Western world, Western society, the US and Ukraine. So they are a good audience to sort of consume anything that sounds rational. You don't care that much if it's true or not, but you want to make it look like a rational, very solidly looking argumentation. And they have competing theories in most of the cases. They start to send out a lot of different versions of the reality, not just one. We rarely see that there is one voice policy when every speaker tries to communicate something along the same lines. Contrarily, there are many speakers putting out different versions with different reasoning why Russia was not to blame in this case. It was an anti-missile system involved, or there was a base of soldiers in this hospital who, and so on and so forth. You would have 3, sometimes 5, sometimes up to 10 different versions of reality. And I think that's for a good reason. So some people may think it's because of the chaos, because they are caught unprepared and they are just, putting versions out of their mind. But there might be a good explanation for this, because if you start polluting internet with different versions, eventually what happens is that the main idea of all of this is that there is no good version. There are just many versions. And so as a person trying to understand what's happening, you will come to a conclusion that no one knows what's happening. It's so unclear. It's so unobvious. It might have been this or that or that. There are so many versions. There is no agreement. So how can you claim you know what's happened if it's so complicated? And I think that's part of the strategy. Make things look not black and white. Make things look complicated, and then people who are they have tendency to have doubts, especially people from conspiracy theory communities. Like, doubts are the main feature of this type of people, right? You try to doubt the main version, the official version, the reality, and they give them a very good satisfaction, because now they say, okay, it's really, there are so many doubts in the official version. You have so many ways to challenge it. And that's a pattern of kind of a narrative behind it. And we see it again and again. We saw it in Kharkiv shelling earlier this year, and we saw it in all the big war crimes that Russia committed. But then there is also a pattern of distribution. So how would you disseminate this information? And there, again, like, there are a couple of ways to do that, but normally we see the key signs of the coordination. And again, normally you would have state-affiliated Telegram channels involved, and generally Telegram and its infrastructure is absolutely crucial. I think Telegram is worth touching as a separate subtopic in today's conversation, because it's massive and it's growing and it's barely regulated. So you would see a lot of Telegram activity. Then it would migrate from Telegram to other platforms. So you would see this migration to Twitter, and within Twitter, it usually starts with a pretty limited pool of spokespeople who are this way or another linked to Russian government or very loyal to it, and they are the first bringers of these versions or of these narratives to Western audiences. And then it starts to be amplified by networks, by coordinated accounts. And then, of course, people who genuinely believe in this, so people who are not bots or not paid by Russia, they just truly believe in this, or it's part of their agenda, they start to bring this message further, and then it explodes, and then it gets amplified.
So Gundars, what is the challenge here for an organization like NATO, or let's say news organizations like the BBC and so on, where you can't just react immediately to something, you can't immediately react to the alternative versions that we've just discussed. You need some kind of validated evidence or information before you go in a certain direction. That means the response of large organizations tends to be slower than the lies can propagate in social media. And what's the role of AI? Is it amplifying? Is it speeding this process up and making it more difficult to react to the multiple versions of reality that propaganda spins?
Yeah, the challenge is actually very complex because there is no how to say, one right way how to approach this. But basically, everything boils down to transparency and keeping the narrative alive. How do you inform your own audiences with the narrative you want them to hear and to read about? So. What Dmitro talked about is that we see in their hostile tactics that they are trying to condition specific audiences into believing that there is an alternative reality. And then when something happens, when the military exercise happens or a summit happens, then there is a really harsh reaction from those bots and trolls and that are keeping up with this illusion of this alternative reality. And for big organizations, for governments, for militaries, it is very crucial, first of all, to understand the situation, to have a really good situational awareness, what is happening, what kind of tactics are being used. And the second thing, really important thing, is to proactively build the resilience in our own audiences through the means of transparent and systematic communication, through education, through media, and so on. So these are to me, these are really crucial steps, and AI indeed plays an important role here, but not as a communicator, because as we already discussed in the beginning, the defenders, the blue teams, I would say, cannot afford cheap mistakes. And unfortunately, the current generative AI are prone to making these cheap mistakes. And we have to be the best in communications, in communicating with our own audiences, and therefore the AI comes into play into this assessment step as well. What is happening? What are the hostile narratives? How these narratives potentially can target specific groups, minorities, and so on. So this is in these analysis processes. This is where AI comes into play to have to provide deeper insights on the situation that's happening. But in terms of communications, of course, AI can help to tailor better messages, tailored specifically for audience groups and so on. But anyway, this should be approved by the leadership. It should be double checked, triple checked that we are not making these cheap mistakes and we are not becoming part of the noise, because this is exactly what we want to avoid.
And that, of course, Russian propaganda is very keen to discredit news sources and discredit institutions through getting them to align themselves with things that aren't true. That can be very damaging. And let's turn to the social media platforms, because one thing that endlessly fascinates me here is their inability to coordinate action against disinformation across different platforms. Of course, they're owned by different entities, different people, different companies. That's part of the challenge. But they also seem to have a problem in identifying and tackling inauthentic behavior. One great example, of course, is X, which if you're on it, as I am doing the NAFO as opposed to NATO thing, you will see that something like X is an absolute sewer of disinformation, hate speech, and there's not much in the way of, I would say, sort of moderation and pushback on that. What's the challenge here? What's preventing these resilient systems, tools, processes, policies from actually being implemented? Dimitro.
That's a very big and multifaceted problem. There's no one answer to this. I think there are various components, one of which is technical, and I doubt the technical component is the key component even. There is, of course, the problem with the incentive structure, generally for big tech platforms. And you usually see that when the incentive is there and they need to fight it, they become better at fighting it at shorter periods of times, usually after elections when everyone is very much concerned about what happened. And then you see action starting to happen. The thing that is pretty counterintuitive, though, is that in Europe, starting from this year, the Digital Service Act, or DSA, came to play. And that's a regulation which is pretty strict, and that was designed to make platforms more accountable about what is being distributed there. And generally, it introduces pretty high fines for violating the rules, and the rules themselves, they are strict, and all the big platforms, I mean, really big ones like Meta and X and TikTok, they fall under this. Interesting, the Telegram doesn't. So Telegram is a different story. And so you would naturally expect that platforms, after hearing of this regulation, would be more cautious. They will double down on their investments on trust and safety, on cleaning up the content, etc. But we don't see this, and even we see quite the opposite trend. Last year, 2023, was the year of layoffs of trust and safety teams. So every single big tech company reduced or completely got rid of these departments, which is surprising, especially given the fact that this year is a year of elections all over the globe, right? So you have a perfect storm, everything's happening. You need this help more than ever, and you do not have it, which is surprising, but it has to do mostly with kind of political decisions within the platforms and the incentive structure than with the technologies. Of course, there are also technological challenges which you can discuss, and it would be an overstatement to say that you can solve this problem super easily. There is no plug-and-play solution to solve it once and forever. But I think that what's currently done is obviously not enough. If we switch into the technology part, so the key challenge, and we talked also to people from big tech, and they see it similarly, you need to balance from the political standpoint, from ethical standpoint, you need to balance the freedom of speech versus the safety of the platform, right? So there is a trade-off here. If you regulate too much, you start removing the authentic content. If you regulate not enough, the bad content, the hostile content will bloom, and you need to find somewhere a middle point. And this problem of this trade-off, it can be translated to a technical problem of precision versus recall, right? So you're trying to predict whether a particular piece of content or a particular account is hostile or not, or a particular piece of content is pushing intentional disinformation or not. So you can be right and you can be wrong as a model in your prediction. And so you want somehow to optimize the model to be right in as many cases as possible, but also, and that would be your precision part, right? You don't want to say something is bad if it is not. But at the same time, you want to miss as little bad content as possible, because if you are too much precision oriented, you will claim 10 pieces, you will flag 10 pieces of content as bad, but you will miss 10,000. And that's not a good trade-off. And there are different strategies how to solve this trade-off, right? Some models are more precision-oriented, some models are more recall-oriented, some are trying to put themselves somewhere in the middle, but there is no perfect solution. There is no way to have a model that will give you 100 accuracy here and there on both sides. You need to compromise. And I think different platforms and different teams, they make their own decision. Where do they put this threshold? Where do they draw the line? And it's a safer bet to be more precision-oriented, right? Because if you're more precision-oriented, no one will claim that you are doing censorship, because you only remove this 1% or top 5% of the worst things where no one has doubts they are bad. Everyone will agree. But then you are missing this another 95%, which are not that straightforward. And that's a problem, and someone needs to work with that. That's partially what we do at Osavo, right? We decided, okay, it's a dirty job, no one wants to do it, but someone needs to do it. So let's try to dig into that content and still find the pieces that should be reacted on, that should be brought up. And that's how we see our mission. to analyze that and to bring that to the table. So platforms know about it, stakeholders like NATO know about it, and then they can do something based on their mandate.
And I've got a continuation question, and then I'll give Gunduz a chance to answer the same one. What is the most effective technique, or is it a mixture of both? Is it sort of semantic pattern matching, looking for particular narratives embedded in the text? And then, of course, you have to teach these systems what those narratives are and maybe use AI to iterate upon them. Or is it in actually looking at the patterns of propagation, distribution propagation, as opposed to what they're actually saying? Or do you use a combination of those methods to try and identify inauthentic behaviors?
Yeah, so we've been thinking a lot about this and trying different things. And where we stopped is kind of a mixture of the two, because two things, they educate each other. So the content part and the behavioral part, or the distribution part. What you care about is this inauthentic and coordinated aspect. Right? What we've been thinking initially that disinformation is all about truth. So there are many terms like this, fake news, for example. So you care about, is it fake or not? Then disinformation, by nature, by definition of disinformation, it means information that is not true. And then it is also intentionally pushed. But the more we've been working, the more we realized that the veracity of the content is lesser of an issue than the authenticity of and the intent behind its distribution. You can take a credible fact and then you will be able to reframe it, put it under a particular narrative, which won't be necessarily not true. It will be just framed in a specific way. But then, due to inorganic ways of amplification, you will achieve an intentionally disproportionate attention towards this, right? So in the real world, you would get 1,000 views, but using techniques and hacking different distribution mechanisms like recommendation feeds, etc., you'll somehow get tens of millions of views there. And that's what we care about, that someone intentionally tries to disrupt what people see online and make it more opinionated, more agenda-driven, even if those facts are legit, right? Still, we have this inorganic component. That's why you want to understand who are the actors involved in the distribution of content, and you want to be able to prove and find evidence that they are connected, and that they are connected in a much less organic way that normal two people would be, right? So if me and you, for example, we have similar set of values and we believe in similar things, every once in a while, we're going to share similar pieces of content, and that would be normal. So we want to be able to distinguish this kind of usual, like organic alignments of people compared to this inorganic alignment when they are coordinated, acting from the one center. And that's a problem that can be translated to a technical problem and can be solved. You basically search for an unusual, abnormal, like anomalous level of coordination of different nodes. But then you would also want to, content is very helpful here, because by analyzing content and analyzing if the content promotes similar narratives over time, you're able to see to what extent are those different actors coordinated. Again, they are more and more sophisticated these days. They would not necessarily repost each other or copy-paste content from each other. They might create different sets of content, but the content is aligned in a way of ideas it's promoting or information episodes it's reacting to, etc. And by being able to make sense of the content and analyze it over time, you're able to better prove the coordination.
And the same question to you, Gunduz. I mean, how do you deal with these different questions of inauthentic behaviors and tackling them?
Yeah, so I already mentioned in the beginning of our discussion that one of the projects that we are running over these past years is a project called Social Media Manipulation Experiment. And so this experiment basically shows how well these social media platforms are able to deal with commercial manipulations, very cheap commercial manipulations on their platform, and whether they are able to identify them fully automatically, what they do when this commercial manipulation is being reported, and so on. So basically, by teaming up with other partners, we are buying these cheap likes and shares on these specific companies, and then we are tracking over time what is happening with those. And this reoccurring theme is that more than like 90% stays on these platforms after even we report it. And the usual response from these companies when we reach out to them is that the experiment is designed in a way that we are not politically sensitive. We are not posting politically sensitive content. This is random content to maximally to minimize the risk that could happen by creating when you compared when you're creating politically sensitive topic and so on. So that's one thing, and as Dmytro mentioned already, that these disinformation teams are being released and fired. So that is one of the alarming indicators that shows that basically shows or highlights the priorities of these social media companies. And when we talk about the technology that could be technically used to tackle the disinformation and inauthentic coordination on these platforms, let's look at, for example, Meta. So they are one of the biggest AI developers and innovators, and they are open sourcing everything that they do. So they are one of the major AI players right now in this AI game. So why they are not like fully capable of automatically removing this content is probably the costs, because let's not forget that social media platforms are very cost oriented and profit oriented. And there was this estimate that ChatGPT query costs like 10 times more than the Google query, and this is because of the resource intensity that is required to run these models, and to run on every comment and every post these large language models to understand like the risks of potential harmfulness. I would say it's very costly right now. The second problem is related to languages and modalities. We only now see a rapid development of vision models that are able to understand images, and again here the cost efficiency comes into the play, because to run on every image and every posted image such trained models to recognize politically sensitive content would be very, very costly for these ones. Another aspect what a bit holds back this fully automated efficient detection is that disinformation actors on certain platforms also earn money by spreading content that is highly engaging to certain audiences. And the disinformation actors also get verified. So it's very hard for these platforms to avoid the false positives, as Dmytro already mentioned, because removing authentic account that is afterwards raising a question and protesting why this happened is more costly for the company, because it means that a human must be involved in reviewing. It costs money, and there are many other aspects why they are trying rather to most likely reduce the filter bubble. So this account is less visible to others, but they are not very keen on removing these ones. And one of the biggest issues is that we lack the unified testing framework that would allow research institutions to test the efficiency of these social media platforms on removing the inauthentic and manipulated and hostile content from the platforms, because these platforms they are closed, and the good days when the Twitter gave the access to the data are over. So it's very hard for the research community to assess what is happening on certain platforms. And this is again a question to the EU, for example, as well, because this could become one of the mandatory capability for these platforms, that they should ensure to the global research facilities the certain access to the data, that they could understand how much the content is being manipulated, what kind of hostile coordinated actions are happening on these platforms, and so on. So being more transparent is one of the keys. Of course, we should avoid creating the Ministry of Truth, but we should find a really good way how to regulate these gatekeepers and how to assess what is happening, because these social media platforms, they are releasing the threat reports, and they are releasing some numbers how much of the content has been removed, but we don't have a full understanding how much stays on these platforms. So we don't have a way how to in a really reliable way how to check like the overall big picture, how much is being manipulated and so on, because we need somehow also to standardize the way how these social media platforms are reporting about this inauthenticity of accounts and coordinated hostile communications as well. And I think that over time we'll come at a point where the regulation frameworks will define what kind of indicators these social media platforms should report. So this is what we are missing right now: the unified approach and unified testing approach, and unified set of key features that these platforms should report about. So we would have a better understanding. Yes.
Well, let's turn to that big question of resilience, because it comes in so many different shapes, sizes, flavors, and colors. You've got fact checking, you've got the amazing stuff that Dimitra and his team do. You also have legislation, but as you say, that's a tricky weapon to wield. There is media literacy. I happen to know the Filter Project very well in Ukraine. That's been highly successful at media literacy courses for a whole range of different people, different sort of demographic ages and groupings within society. How do we create resilience? And what are the different strands of a resilient strategy that Europe and Britain, I would say, need to adopt? And of course, the US, if we want to include that in there as well in election year. Dimitra, let's start with you.
Yeah, you rightfully mentioned a couple of techniques that are out there, right? One of which is fact checking, or as professional slang calls it, debunking. And there are regulations, there are sanctions, banning accounts, taking down the accounts. Most of those methods, they have one thing in common, is that they are reactive by nature. So you're also one step behind, and you're trying to work with what's already happened. The problem with this approach is that because of the fact that you are one step behind, you are actually, lagging. You're always in a catch-up game, and just as a psychological phenomena, people tend to believe more in what they got to interact with in the first place, right? So their first impression is the biggest impression. It's very hard to debunk something if you already interacted with the poisonous content. Very hard to convince you that it was not true. So I think the holy grail of the whole industry is to find a way to be proactive instead of being reactive, to do something in advance. And there are promising techniques here, one of which is called pre-bunking, which is kind of similar to debunking. And the key, again, the holy grail is to be able to have the premonition of what's going to be happening, to be able to act ahead, to act accordingly. And that has to do with this strategic awareness, right? Because to be able to predict what's going to happen, you need to know very well who are the hostile actors, what they are trying to achieve, what they have been doing for the past periods. And by having all this data in place and knowledge in place, you can start thinking strategically about possible next steps, and then you can be one step earlier. There are some projects around these. Some are connected to elections, some are connected to other issues, but I would say that still kind of state of the art in the industry is debunking, and people are trying to switch to this pre-approach, which is easier said than done, because it's very easy to understand what to do if the fake is already out there. Very hard to know what to do if it's not there, right? How to strategically expect it. But there is another thing and I really like this approach. I've heard it from many people, from the governments and from policymakers, and it looks at the problem more broadly. So when we are saying that there is a problem of disinformation, or as Europe now calls it, FIMI, or foreign information manipulation and interference, right? There is some foreign actor trying to influence your audiences. They may be successful and they may be not successful. And the question is, what are the factors? What does it depend on? Why some campaigns are successful, why some of them fail, and why in some countries the disinformation it blooms, and in some other countries it has almost no effect. And it has to do with a kind of background condition. So if there is a lot of trust and unity among the people within a nation or within a particular group, and they trust each other, they trust media because media are transparent, they trust their government, again, because the government is transparent. And the strategic communications within the country, coming from government and coming from bigger actors, they are done in a good way, in an effective way. So they cultivate the transparency and they cultivate trust and unity between people. Then it's very hard to run a good disinfo against it, because people won't believe it. They have a very high level of trust towards their own authorities, so they don't care much about those foreign things, right? Another situation is when you have the opposite. When you have a lot of mistrust there, you have a lot of big problems that are deep within the community, then it's easy to manipulate this. And so the thing is that we also see it in Ukraine. Those influence operations, they never happen on an empty space, right? They always try to target a particular problem, and the bigger the problem is, the more success they get. So one of the ways to tackle the problem is to tackle the problem of disinformation is to solve other problems. And so the less problems you have, the less successful the info campaigns will be.
So the challenge of the threat against democracy is actually more democracy, more transparency, and say building trust there. Pre-bunking has a curious kind of science fiction flavor to it, a little bit like Minority Report or something. There's something slightly sort of sinister in that, but it also relies on huge amounts of data, I would imagine, as well. Gundars, what is the challenge here for NATO? And the role it plays, communicating with democratic institutions, etc., to try and advise on ways of making society, institutions, media more resilient against disinformation, misinformation, and the other sort of flavors of manipulation that Russia utilizes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I cannot speak in NATO's name, but I can more or less describe what could be relevant to a large military organization. And one of the things is this term that briefly Dmitry already touched upon, this pre-bunking, but we can also introduce a new term which is called the audience inoculation. Why I'm using this inoculation is because the social media platforms are basically inseparable from our work and everyday lives. Thus, it has become as a digital and critical infrastructure, and we should have the attitude towards it as a critical infrastructure. Disinformation actors will use mistakes for different governments. They will use corruption to fuel hostile narratives. They will increase the distrust in governments and so on. This is one of the main challenges, how to maintain the trust in governments and also to the large military organizations as well as for the NATO. It is not only about inoculating society and equipping it with the right tools, it is also about strengthening the trust in governments, boosting economy, strengthening international relations, improving education, and so on. And this is where large military organizations like NATO also can do a great deal of work, because strengthened trust and and cooperation between governments is one of the key elements how to keep up the strong narrative of unity, of defensive posture, and cutting it and like capability of using the cutting edge technologies to protect our own audiences. So and lastly, the proactive involvement of the research field. It is all this problem cannot lie only on the shoulders of the NATO. It should be on especially on each of the nations shoulders as well, because involvement of the education sector and the research field to boost the interest of the general audience to understand this phenomenon of disinformation is one of the keys to bring on understanding what is happening in information space. And we should not allow our enemies to mystify and to confuse us. Therefore, proactive communication, building trust in governments, and strengthening the collaboration these are the key areas that will help in the long term to maintain our capability in democracies.
I only have one question left. We could probably talk for many hours, but I think we're running short on time. I strongly advise people to read the paper that's been co-authored here, because that's where these questions come from. That's where some of these amazing insights you've talked about can be found in more detail. So, of course, we will include a link to that paper in the description of the video. The last question here is, what should we be looking out for next? One of the interesting new phenomenon which you've described in the paper is this ability of AI to take real stories from a variety of newspapers and then to augment them, to change them, to collate them and curate them in a way that distorts reality, and then to republish them under what would seem to be, if you weren't paying attention, would seem to be a sort of genuine news organizations, news portals and websites. This is something that clearly AI can do at a tremendous scale, and the quality, the authenticity of this is only going to improve as, of course, we know the development of AI is on an almost exponential kind of curve at the moment. So, Dimitra, what should we be looking out for, and what is the threat of these sort of personalized propaganda news aggregation techniques?
Yeah, I'll start with the second part of the question, but I also have one idea of what we should be waiting for. Regarding those news thing and reframing the context, I think that's very important because, again, coming back to the beginning of the conversation, when people think deepfakes or they think generated content, they think that the risk is that everything is going to be fabricated. Like the fact that never existed will be used to be pushed to the broader audience. But to me, the bigger risk is not altering the reality to that extent, generating facts that never existed. Because with those facts, it's very easy to prove, to double check, to verify that it's not true. And it's not that easy to believe in this. With so many instances of deepfakes, including deepfakes of Ukrainian president saying this or that he never said in reality, none of them had a massive impact. And because of the reason that it's Zelensky, he almost lives on air. He's always live. It's very easy to know what he did and did not say. And so those fakes, they pretty much everyone ignored them. It was pretty obvious that they're not true. It's a very different thing when you reframe the context while keeping the fact the same, right? So something happened. It is kind of true. So you do not deny that it occurred in the reality. But then you push a different opinion there, or you push a different narrative there. You attach it to a story that you want to promote. And I think we know very well, as people like connected to media and to journalism and to information environment, that it's very easy to connect very different facts to very different stories in almost an arbitrary way. And it can be very surprising sometimes how this fact can be promoted to that story. You would never even assume that they are linked, but a creative narrator can do that job. And I think AI is this narrator that can do that job for you well. And that's what we see. You can take a respectful article, you can take a solid piece of news, and then you can augment it with an opinion as seen by a particular persona or by a particular group. We even tried to reverse engineer some of the AI-generated comments on Twitter, and it seems like the prompts behind them were comment this as if you were a certain person of a certain race and nationality and age. And that's where it becomes problematic, because you can very easily reutilize the same fact in so many contexts and make it appealing to so many different groups and make it part of so many different stories. I think that's definitely the risk of this. And talking about the more distant future, and in the world of AI, distant, it can mean 6 months to 1 year, because things are very quickly changing. There is one new media that's emerging, and it's a one-to-one conversational media. So unlike social platforms, we are here complaining that social platforms are not transparent. We cannot see a lot of what's happening on Twitter, but those one-to-one chats with companies like, for example, Character AI in the United States, it's one of the biggest chatbots now. So everyone knows ChatGPT. Not that many people know Character AI, but they are huge. They have hundreds of millions of users already online. And they're talking one-on-one with their virtual friends. And they're talking on many things and many different issues. So they can talk about their personal life, but they can also talk about politics. They can also talk about news. They can discuss some stories from Twitter. And who knows what the AI will reply to them, right? That's one of the new mediums, and as every new medium, it brings new problems. So I think disinformation will be present there as well.
And Gundars, the last word for you. What do you see as these future threats and, of course, these news aggregators, which may well be a problem in the run-up to the US election?
Yeah, one of the threats is related to generative AI and the future of search engines, because we see a new trend that these search engines are providing results that are interpreted by the generative AI models. And of course, the generative AI is not an end state. This is a current iteration of this creative AI that will be improved over time. But this is a good example what could happen, because if you train your generative AI model with specific values, with specific opinions, then the end user might get a digested version of the search results, and this can create a problem of over reliance of this technology. So this is one of the major problems. What I see is that people are relying too much on the information that's being provided by these generative AI models. And also I wanted to emphasize the same problem with the personalized assistants. Not only because of these opinionated and digested versions of the data that you might get, but also about how much data you give to the third-party services as well. So if you think that social media platforms are kind of bad guys in collecting how we think and what we do, then imagine if we reveal everything what we do during the day to these personalized assistants, and they are just creating even more personalized profiles of what you are interested in and what you like and how you behave in certain situations. And there is another risk that these costs of running these really high-performant models are so high that we are risking that certain governments might become like super governments with all these capabilities that are required to assess what is happening in the information domain. However, smaller governments that cannot afford in hosting these large data centers and so on, they might risk of lagging behind. They're risking on being behind in comparing to the large governments in terms of the capabilities for assessment and data processing capabilities. So that's also one of the risks, and I hope that we'll find a way how to use these technologies for a common good, for strengthening democracies, not the contrary.
Well, this has been an absolutely thrilling discussion. I don't know, before we go, Dimitri, if you want to sort of just jump in and describe how your software is evolving, what is the next evolution of your software and solution in its fight against disinformation?
Yeah, I would say that we have a couple of vectors of expanding the software. One of which is going to the places where disinformation is usually originating from, and it's super important to listen to the, as we call them, shady corners of internet, to the places where information is already circulating before it goes to Twitter, for example, or before it goes to Facebook. It's obviously Telegram, and we are already strong there because we realized that's the place to be. But there are others. We are now expanding a lot on TikTok capabilities and on some other platforms like Discord, for example, and Reddit, to be able to know about those early discussions that then can, by the way, guide your pre-bunking capabilities. If you spot pretty early on something just emerging on TikTok, you can be able to be now one step ahead of the hostile actor because it's not there yet, and you can do something about it. Another thing is about content analysis. We're experimenting a lot now about around this idea that there are facts and there are opinions, and they can be split in two distinct categories. And it's super important to understand how different facts and opinions correspond to each other. So which facts are used to facilitate certain narratives, and also how facts are being framed within different narratives, and how one fact can be described very differently across different media with different biases. That's one of the features that we're going to be releasing soon, to give the visibility of how those two things coexist and how the information is being used and weaponized through different opinions and lenses of narratives.
That's absolutely fascinating, and I hope to be able to follow that journey and have you back on the channel soon to talk about how this rapidly evolving ecosystem is taking shape, and how Russia is finding new ways, and not just Russia, of course, China, Iran, and others are finding new ways to manipulate our actions and our thinking through disinformation. But for now, Gundars and Dimitra, thank you so much for coming onto the channel. Thank you for sharing your incredible insight and experience with us. And I look forward to talking again in future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.